started, I want to pass around a sign-up sheet. I'm finally doing a newsletter every 6 months, and in the next newsletter, I'll give you an update on the Disney movie based on the Cape Cod story, The Finest Hours. So if you're interested in the newsletter, please print your email. There's one for the front of the room, and here's one for the back of the room. There's a pen inside. And there's a little box you'll see there. It says Get Published, and that's for if you're working on your own book idea. Once a year I teach a course with a publisher on how to get it in the hands of the very best publisher, like how to write the right proposal, that kind of thing. And then the other box says Survival Lessons Lead, and that's a presentation I do for business groups about what I learned from survivors that can help all of us when we feel like we're overwhelmed. So they have a few tricks. And it was funny, the Boston Globe ran this article about me in the book, and they said he's the master of disasters. And I didn't like that line at all, because I hop from topic to topic. They're not all true survival at sea stories. In fact, one is called There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse, and the subtitle is Misadventures of a Mountain Man Wannabe. It's about my cabin in Vermont when I was 22. Tried to live like a mountain man up there and failed miserably. So it's a little bit like Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods. And then this book is a real departure, but one that's close to my heart. It just came out this week. It's called Derek's Gift. And the subtitle is A True Story of Love, Courage, and Lessons Learned. And I refer to it as kind of a cross between Tuesdays with Maury and The Fault in Our Stars. It's a true story about a North Shore teenager who kept this incredible journal when he was fighting rare form of cancer his senior year of high school. And a teacher gave me the journal, and I was just blown away at a teenager's insights and his suggestions on how the rest of us can all live better. And then, so what we did was we put his journal in the front of the book, but then I picked up where he left off, because he keeps talking about these 5 special people in his life. And when I read his journal, I wondered, well, what happened to them after Derek died? How did their lives change? Because he keeps talking about how special they were, and they really had some unique journeys afterwards. Some of them changed their lives because of their experience with Derek. So it's a 3-part book, and that the first part is his journal, the middle part follows the lives of these 5 people in the next 10 years, and then the third part is the summary of some of the more important lessons learned from all 6, Derek and these 5. So with that, we'll get to the bounty. There's kind of a funny story of how I got hooked on this topic. I had just been on Fox and Friends, so it was my first time on national TV, and they had me on because of this approaching Hurricane Sandy. And at the end, they conclude our interview with, "So, Mr. Tougias, could there be any ships in the path of this storm?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And that's kind of how I ended it. And then I go home and I turn on CNN, and I'm hearing these reports that the bounty's in trouble in Hurricane Sandy. And I go, oh my God, I just look like the biggest idiot. Right? Well, absolutely not. The storm is so well forecast. And that's kind of what planted the seed of, I should look into this. Why were they out there with this hurricane? And so I teamed up with Doug Campbell, who has a lot more experience than I do with sailing in tall ships. Everybody assumes I'm a sailor, but I'm not. I'm a fisherman out of the ocean. And I write the books for they're character-driven stories, so they're for the general public. They're not meant for boaters exclusively. They're people who like a character-driven story. And Doug was really the perfect person to team up with, because he had that sailing experience. And he was a journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, so he really loved to dig into the background. And we paint a picture of the captain in the book. And so what I do with the slides is I give an overview. You know, in 45 minutes it's hard to cover the full story, but I try to paint an overview of what happened and do it similar to the book, in that there's 3 parts. So the first is a little bit about the ship and the crew and why is the big question. So the ship was actually a replica of the mutiny on the Bounty ship from early history. And I remember reading the trilogy. I wonder how many people ever read the trilogy by Nordhoff and Hall. They wrote Mutiny on the Bounty, then they wrote Men Against the Sea, and then Pitcairn's Island. If you ever get a chance, they're great reads, fabulous writers. And so this Bounty was a duplicate, replica, but a little bit bigger. So with the long bowsprit, it stretched to 180 feet. And we'll talk about the crew in a bit. But a beautiful ship. Jim, I think this might be your slide. But just a beautiful ship, and 3-masted. And it wasn't Coast Guard approved for taking out passengers on paid voyages. You couldn't say, go through Boston Harbor for $25. You could board the ship and tour it, but it had to be at the dock. So it had its own crew to take it from port to port. And it was privately owned by a businessman from Long Island, but for years the town of Fall River owned it. But it's very expensive to keep up these wooden boats, so Fall River ended up selling them. So Captain Walbridge, by all accounts, was very knowledgeable, and crew loved the guy. Great teacher, had a way with younger people on how to teach them. He was a New Englander, grew up in Vermont, actually not far from my cabin. So, most of the research that we got into his background was this was one really bright guy, and the crew was loyal as could be. And we'll get into a little bit about those dynamics as we get into the talk. So when we were doing the book, it was early on. The ship had only sank maybe 3 months earlier when we got cranked up. So not all the crew members wanted to talk, and I don't blame them. Some were traumatized, some just didn't want anything to do with it, and others did. But we also had access to the Coast Guard inquiry. It was a 5-day affair where everyone testified, and you heard from all sorts of people. Doug attended all of those meetings, and I was able to form contacts with some of the crew, such as Adam Protash. And Adam was great to work with because he was very open about his thoughts and what happened. And I come back to him a little bit later because of the crew, when the Bounty got in trouble, and it was just starting to be rocked by the storm, Adam suffered serious injuries, cracked vertebrae in his back. This isn't when the ship capsized, this is back when it's just getting hit by these waves. Broken collarbone, head injury, so he had to deal with more than the rest of the crew that was in pretty good shape. There was a crew member that surprised me. Claudine Christian was actual descendant of Fletcher Christian, who was on board this trip. She was 42 years old. This was her first summer on board the Bounty, but loved it and made a great connection with the rest of the sailors. And so now I'll give you a little bit of the backstory before the storm. They had come from Booth Bay Harbor, where the ship had undergone a lot of repairs. A lot of caulking had to be redone. There was some rot in the planks that had to be replaced. And it was quite extensive, and they tackled as much as they could, but there was still some issues they never got to. And then the ship, when that was done, sailed from Booth Bay down to New London. And on that trip, a couple of the crew members noticed that the pumps, wooden boats are always leaking. They're always pumping out water. weren't drawing the normal volume as in the past. And so that was an issue, and they brought it up, and everybody was aware of it, but it never actually got solved. And in New London, they did some sailing with a crew from a submarine, and while in New London, word started coming out about this potential hurricane, and that was on a Thursday. So this, I believe this shot was from Thursday, and the hurricane was located down in the Caribbean, and they were projecting it to go like this, and then potentially come into the eastern seaboard like that. And the captain, the plan was to sail from New London down to St. Petersburg, Florida next. And he had a discussion with the first mate about doing this. The captain wanted to do it. He'd been in bad weather before, thought they could go well to the east of this hurricane and get around it. And the first mate, whose name was John Svensson, said, I don't know about that, maybe we should stay in port. And a long discussion ensued, and I know there were quotes in the newspaper where the captain said the ship is safer at sea than it would be at port, and that's usually true for a ship because it'd be, ramming up against the pilings. But it's certainly not safer for the crew. But that wasn't his primary reason. His primary reason was he had been through bad weather before, thought he could skirt this hurricane, and wanted to keep on the schedule because there was a big event planned in St. Petersburg. So there were different factors going on. And so that's the first mate, John, and he gave the captain his opinion, but the captain said, well, why don't I do this? Why don't I call the crew together, tell them what I plan to do, and if anybody wants to leave, they can do so. So he calls the crew together, and he says, I know you're getting text messages and calls from home about this potential hurricane. I want you to know it's okay. If you don't want to go this voyage, that's okay, no hard feelings. You can meet up with us in St. Petersburg. And no one took him up on his offer. And in the book, Doug and I tried not to give any personal opinions. We were more interested in making you feel like you were part of the crew in going through this ordeal. But at the end of the book, in the author's note, I give some opinions, and maybe at the end, after we close it out, I'll give you an opinion why I think every single one of the crew decided to follow the captain. But off they go. They to a person, they go. And the thing about this storm that made it unique is there's been hurricanes a lot more powerful than this. It wasn't as powerful a hurricane as many others, but there'd never been a hurricane this wide. This was the widest swath of ocean or land that a hurricane has ever covered. Now, they didn't know that, obviously, on boat, that that's what was going to happen, but that was the unusual thing about Hurricane Sandy, the sheer size of this thing. And so Walbridge tells the crew, okay, get ready, we're going to leave in a couple hours. And our plan is we're going to go east-southeast to get on the eastern side of this storm. And if the storm decides to go further east out to sea, well, then we can change course accordingly. We're going to have all the latest weather information to dodge this thing. And so they leave, and probably the only person with real misgivings was Claudine, because she did text her parents and later an email as well, saying, we may have to go all the way to Europe the way this storm is shaping up. And then a little later in an email she said, just in case anything happens, I want you to know I'm happy as can be, and that I love you. So you could see she was worried about what they were doing. And the first part of the voyage is fine, the first couple of days, but when you got into Saturday, that's when they started to feel the effects of Sandy. The seas were building And you never want to see waves like this coming at a boat. They're steep seas and steep waves, and they're going to break. And so what happens is they've gone to the southeast to this point, and now we're feeling the effects of the hurricane, and the latest report is now saying this is going to be one wide hurricane. So it's not as if the hurricane's going to sweep by here and not affect them. So they decide, okay, we got to change plans. We're going to cut across and we're going to head towards land. And in an email, the captain says, we think we can kind of find that, just that right spot between Sandy and land, and then we'll get on that southwest side where it's always a little bit safer on that southwest quadrant, and they have following winds to propel them towards Florida. So that is when they make the decision to change. And the Gulf Stream plays a role in all this, and here's an infrared map. You see the warm waters of the Gulf Stream. I never knew, though, it had these cold water and warm water eddies coming off it. And one of the things that makes the Gulf Stream so dangerous in a storm is it's flowing this way. You have a low pressure system goes counterclockwise, so wind-generated waves would be coming against it at a certain time. So you'd have current and waves colliding, and that's not good. And it's just by chance that the last 3 books I've done have all taken place in the Gulf Stream. The Storm Too Soon, especially because the Gulf Stream produced 80-foot consistent seas. I'd never heard of such a thing. I've heard of road waves that big, but never consistent seas of 80 feet. And I'll show you one from that, a Storm Too Soon storm in the Gulf Stream. And wouldn't you know it, when they start to encounter their real problems on the boat, meaning they can't keep up with the incoming water, they're on the edge of the Gulf Stream, not a good place to run into trouble. This is the great room near this, near the stern. And as these waves build, the Captain Walbridge is injured. He's actually thrown backwards into one of these tables, so it hits him right in the lower back. And although he was still walking and commanding the ship, he was in serious pain. So something had happened. And that's in my research of these different stories. There's many times you can skirt a storm and be fine, and the ship will be fine, but I almost always read of accounts where, the boat's fine and everything, but somebody gets injured because there's one wave that hits when they don't expect, or it's bigger than the others, or a different direction. So you may escape with your life and the ship may be fine, but there's usually an injury when the seas are big and confused. So you had Captain Walbridge injured, you had Adam Prokash, who I showed you earlier, severely injured, all while the ship is becoming pretty much dead in the water. It had 2 propellers, but the engines are starting to go on the fritz, and the main issue is just incoming water. The planks had been dry, above the waterline, been dry all summer, so they shrink. That allows some water through the seams, both on the deck and in the hull. And they're having issues even with a portable pump. So if everything had gone perfectly, I think the captain's plan would have worked. But you could never plan on being on the ocean, things going perfectly. So there's a number of issues coming up. The pumps in the water being the biggest, but they also had things like sails coming unfurled in the storm, and somebody had to actually go up into that rigging during the storm. I can't even imagine. So they're just a compounding of problems, and they're getting worse. Sparks are flying because you're getting electrical surges. Now, there are no photos from the Bounty during the storm, but this is the Bounty in an earlier storm, a couple years early. We tracked down one of the sailors on it, and he shared this photo with us. So you get a sense of what it must have been like when you go up on deck and you see are starting to build. So as Saturday becomes Saturday evening, they now realize, okay, this isn't just a minor issue. The storm is coming from the south. We're directly in its path. We better alert the Coast Guard to our problems. And they send an email to their home base who forwards it to the Coast Guard. And I'm paraphrasing, but it says to the effect, we're taking on water, pumps cannot keep up with it, but we think we can make it to morning, the ship's doing fine. And the Coast Guard gets that and they're like, wait a minute, the ship's doing fine, they're taking on more water than they can keep up with, and the Coast Guard is having a real hard time understanding, well, just what kind of jeopardy are they in? And they make a difficult decision about launching an aircraft into a hurricane. It's not like the old Coast Guard where you have to go out but you don't have to go back. So they're doing risk assessments. Can we do this? And I think they made the right call of leaving it up to the pilot of the aircraft of how far into the hurricane can you get. And their thinking is, we're not flying out to do a rescue because they just said the ship's doing fine, can make it to morning. We're flying out to make radio communications in case we lose all communication with them via email or via the satellite phone. But on board the ship, the crew's starting to know this is a losing battle, and they're thinking, yeah, we're going to have to abandon the ship come daylight. So one of the big issues concerning them was all that rigging, miles and miles of rigging. So when you do abandon the ship, you don't want any of that in the water. And this is the pilot who flew the C-130, and I worked really closely with him. His name is Wes. And Wes McIntosh said, as we're flying out, and we get a little closer, and again, they've left up to him, but how close do you think you can get? You think your crew's in jeopardy turn back? And he said, as we got closer towards the hurricane, these gusts would hit our aircraft. It was a big aircraft, and he said, all of a sudden we'd shoot up 200 feet, and then when the gust passed, he said we'd plummet 400 feet, just dropping straight down. So he said, us two pilots in the front, we have a little better situation, but he said the rest of the crew is motion sick and beat up and bruised, and he's wondering just how close they really can get. He also said the wings, I never knew this, he said the wings were flexing 4 feet. He's going like this. And he gets out towards the Bounty, and he's on the radio saying, Bounty, this is C-130, and all of a sudden he hears the Bounty loud and clear. And it's John Svensson. And Wes is so happy that they've made communications and the ship is still afloat. And he says, what's your plans? And John says, same as before, we're going to hang on till morning and then do an orderly evacuation because we're just not keeping up with the water. And then all of a sudden, this is what Wes sees through the night vision goggles. They've been over the Bounty a little while, and then suddenly they hear over the radio, abandoning ship, and then click, the radio goes dead. So Wes takes the plane down as low as he dares to about 500 feet, and through the NVGs, this is what they saw. And through a night vision camera, they took this picture. So all of a sudden, the ship had lurched on its side. And crew members are either falling into the water or trying to time a jump because the deck would be at an angle and there's no way to hang on. And Claudine was up on deck, and I should mention that they did the right thing. They all got in their survival suits and got up from those lower decks. But it wasn't that much earlier, maybe half an hour earlier. So talk about a lucky break coming up out of the lower decks. Had it gone on its side and they'd been down below, forget it. So they're up on decks, they all get in survival suits, and I think one issue was they didn't have time to fully secure the survival suits. You know, it should come all the way to your nose, and then there's a patch that goes over your mouth. They probably are thinking, we'll hang on till morning, and probably have them zipped up to their neck, because a lot of the suits allowed a fair amount of water to get in. Claudine was on deck, and she was with another sailor and said, what do I do? And he said, my legs are tangled in the rigging. You got to move, you know, towards the life rafts in the stern and jump. And so she went that way. He freed his legs and slid off. And that's what's happening. One by one, they're falling in the water. The captain had gotten in his survival suit. One of the crew members saw him kind of making his way towards the back of the ship, because there were things you could kind of walk on, even though the deck was like this, and you went from perch to perch.
Excuse me, quick question. How many total crew on board?
There was, including the captain, 16. And that was kind of it'd be kind of a bare bones crew. You know, it wasn't below the safety level, but anything less than that might have been too few to do all the tasks. I mean, they were working around the clock for 48 hours before the ship went on its side, because there was just so many tasks to do. But I put this picture in to give you the idea of what it would look like when you're in the water and these big masts are coming down at you, because the ship was, you know, when it went on its side, these are the masts, it would rock up with a wave and then boom, slam back down, then rock up and then boom. And so people are in the water seeing this mast come down. If you get hit by the mast, that's it. But many got hit by the spreaders or the rigging, and they're each trying to do their best to get away from this ship that's like a battering ram. The life raft commercials always make it look so easy. They never do the advertisements in the store. Well, what happens is, of the 16, 2 pods of people get together. There's a pod of, let's see, 6 and another one of 7. Each one finds a life raft and, you know, gets it out of the canister. And again, I'm skipping things in the story, but gets the life rafts inflated. And then the thing that really surprised me was they've got these great big life rafts. They're all inflated. Some of the crew's together. They can't get in them because the water went down into the legs of the survival suits. So when they get to the door, they can't pick their legs up. There's, you know, pounds and pounds of water in there. That became a huge problem. It took, in one case, an hour for them to get just one person in, lifting the lightest person, you know, everybody trying to push in a hurricane. You can imagine how hard it must have been. So despite survival suits and life rafts, your safety's still not insured. But so you've got 13 people accounted for in these 2 groups and 3 unaccounted for. And those 3 would be the captain, Claudine, and the first mate, John Spencer. He was the one on the radio. So, because Wes sees the ship on its side and had heard them say, quickly abandoning ship, he immediately does what he can, you know, dropping life rafts, but the wind just takes it away. He drops flares to mark the spots. But he calls Elizabeth City and says, we need helicopters out here right away if you think it's safe for them to fly. So now EC has another big decision. Do we launch helos into the storm? They weren't going to. The plan was to launch helos in the morning. They had daylight, not at night. And again, they do a whole risk assessment. They tell the pilots, do your best, see how far you can get. We know there's people in the water now. And so a good portion of the book talks about what I think is a miraculous rescue. So it's the big Jayhawk helicopters that go out. The ship went over about 90 miles off Cape Hatteras. So that gives the Jayhawks enough fuel to get out there and do some rescues. and they're going to need more than one helicopter. So they have a ready crew at the station, and they really were ready. So they launched within 15 minutes. And this is the crew, and on the left is the rescue swimmer Randy Haba, and next to him is the pilot Steve Cerveni, and then Jane Penna, the co-pilot, and then Michael Lufkin, our hoist operator who handled the cable. And in the book, I get into their backgrounds a little bit. Particularly Steve was an interesting story. A year and a half prior to this, he was in a helicopter crash when he was taking a Coast Guard helicopter over the Rocky Mountains and almost lost his life, was told he'd never walk again, and somehow after a year and a half of therapy, he's back behind the wheels, and he's the guy that has duty that night that they send into the hurricane. So I thought, that was amazing. I would have quit the Coast Guard, that's for sure, after that incident. So they've got a pretty good crew. Randy and Steve especially have a lot of experience. Jane and Michael a little newer. And out they go. Finding the rafts is tough. Now, this is what I was talking about, the waves the Gulf Stream can produce. This slide wasn't from the Bounty, it's from the Storm Too Soon. But here's the life raft, this size, and there's the wave. It's 80 feet. So imagine you'd be a little speck in that life raft. In the case of the Bounties, the waves were about 30 feet, so the wave would be like this, and they'd be a speck here. But a storm too soon, I have never come across a storm like that, with consistent waves of 80 feet. In fact, the pilot told me one wave picked up the rescue swimmer so high, he was at eye level with the helicopter. And the helicopter was staying at a hover of 100 feet, to be a good 20 feet above the waves. He said, I've never seen anything like it. So in this case, the first thing they do is they've got the C-130 giving them instructions through their headsets, and Steve Cerveni hears that the C-130 has spotted one strobe light in a survival suit that's floating a little different than the rest. And when I say the rest, I'm talking about a ton of survival suits. At least 30 are out in different, spanning almost a mile. We know there's only 16 crew members, so some of these were empty that washed off the boats. The strobes were water activated and went on. So they don't know which one has people in it and which ones don't, but they pick one that seems to be different. And that's where the helicopter goes first. And so a lot of the action is right in the doorway of the Jayhawk. So this is how the rescue swimmers go down. They go down on a harness, and usually what they'll do is if they're rescuing people from a life raft, they'll unhook from the cable, swim to the life raft, grab a person, stuff them in the basket. The hoist operator would have brought the hook back up, put the basket on, and he'll extract them one by one. Well, in this case, because they just see this one lone survival suit almost a mile from the vessel, the rescue swimmer decides, I'm going to stay on the cable and just put this guy in the strop, a sling, and bring him up with me, wrap my legs around him. But the waves are so big, when they put him down, what happens is he's still on the cable. When a wave falls out from underneath him, he's dangling in the air. So for 1 minute, the rescue swimmer is swimming through the water. The next minute, he's back up in the air. And he and Michael have to time just how much cable you've got to release. So it took them 3 tries. Randy did, just pummeled. But he finally did get to that one survival suit, and lo and behold, there was someone in it. And it was John Spencer, who I think is the luckiest person on the planet, because if the C-130 didn't pick that out as being something odd about that one strobe, the Jayhawk wouldn't have gone there first. He would have drifted even miles away, and they wouldn't have got him in time. And he had injuries himself, a broken hand. I'm sure he was hypothermic. He wasn't a survival suit. But Randy was able to get him up. So by this time, the C-130 is left because of fuel issues, and West gets the news we've extracted one survivor, and cheers erupt on the C-130 because they thought everybody died because they kept trying to raise them on the radio, no comment. So they now had some hope. And then they put Randy down to the life raft where they've located some people in it, and he starts taking them one by one, stuff them in the basket. He'll stay in the water. By this time the life raft will drift far away because it's a big target for the wind. And it's a long process because you then, once you get the survivor up out of the basket, now you've got to lower the hook to get your rescue swimmer and now hunt around for the life raft, where did it go? And then do the next person and the next. And he gets a total of 4 of the 7 out. And then he comes back up, he's still got a little energy left, and the pilot, Steve Cerveni, says, nope, we've hit bingo, meaning fuel. We've got just enough fuel to make it back. And Randy's like, there's 2 more people, or 3 more people in that life raft. And Steve said, another helicopter's coming out, we have to leave now, and they do. And so they've got the first batch of survivors. They did their rescue, the entire thing, at night, which is incredible. And I was just rereading that chapter before I came here, and poor Michael Tougias would be this guy. This is the second helo, but pretend it's night. He's got a glove on his hand, and he's trying to direct this. In his other hand, he's got a pendant like this to raise and lower the cable. But all he's got is one little spotlight down there. He can't see where the raft is, can't see where the survivors are. He's trying to do everything by the one spotlight. And he couldn't do this with his night vision goggles on at the same time because he's got to do some close spine work, like unclip the cable, put the basket on, do work inside the aircraft as well. One of the first people they got out, that Randy got out, was the oldest crew member, Doug Campbell. And what rescue swimmers do is they'll go up and they'll say, is anybody hurt? And I used to think, oh, take that person first because they need medical attention. It's not for that reason they do it. They take who they think is going to be the most difficult to get in the basket, while the rescue swimmer has the most energy. So he sees Doug Campbell just kind of slumped over in the middle and not responding, and he points to him and goes, you first. And he puts him in the basket and he comes up first. So I learned a valuable lesson if you're ever in a life raft. The rest, you want to be the first one out, either look like you're hurt or say you can't swim. Because they'll take the person who says, I don't know how to swim first. Because again, you're not going to have much help getting that person in the basket. It's all about the rescue swimmer using their maximum strength for the hardest survivor. So the second helo goes out, and they've got things a little easier because of daylight. And we're going to focus on the rescue swimmer, Dan Todd over there, because he's got quite a job ahead of them. They took this picture, and this is the picture that's on the cover of the book, and people say, great painting. It's actually a photo taken with Koski's iPhone from the helo. It's unbelievable. And they kind of search around the ship, and even in the mast, thinking like, is this a survivor up there in the red survival suit? And it's hard to tell. Things are hanging from the rigging, and they do as good a search as they can because they have daylight, and they determine there's nobody near the ship. These blinking strobes are spread out all over the place, and you have these life rafts. So the C-130 directs, the new C-130s come out, and they direct this helicopter to a second life raft, and they say, we think there's people in this one. And that's where they go to work. So Dan would be at the doorway. When they get above the life raft, they put him down. He'd be in a dry suit in case an emergency ever happened, and preserve as much of his body heat as possible. And this is him being lowered. and he's made it to the life raft. And this is kind of what rescue swimmers do to calm people down. Dan's, hanging on here, and he's going to pull himself and his head in and shout instructions. But first he goes, "Hey, I'm Dan, I hear you need a ride." To try and calm him down. And then he kind of gets inside to tell him what's going to happen, and the whole life raft goes way up on its side, and he goes tumbling into the survivors. Doesn't flip, but comes back around. He's like, "Oh boy, so he gives him that warp speed, we get move." And he starts extracting them. And Dan was the only person to be quoted by the president, because when he went to New Jersey, he said, "So our young men and women of the Coast Guard stay cool under pressure," and he quoted Dan saying, "Hey, I'm Dan, I hear you need a ride." So I like to give Dan a hard time that he's the only one that's ever been quoted by the president. And Adam Prokash is in this life raft, and he's the one with the serious injuries, so they all point to him that he's got to go first. And because he's got back injuries, Dan's going, "Can you get out of the raft?" And I don't know how Prokash sucked it up, but he said, "Somehow I got in, somehow I can get out." And he does. And he's the first person extracted. And then Dan starts repeating this, get back up on the hook, find the life raft, get off the hook, swim to the raft, get the next person, over and over. And what happens is the life raft, though, is getting lighter. And eventually, there's 2 people left and the whole thing flips. And now they're trapped. And here's Dan in the water, and his brain is just racing. Oh my God, they're drowning inside the life raft. And big sea came up and buried Dan, and he couldn't get there. It took him forever. Finally, he found a line that was trailing from the raft and was able to pull himself kind of. And he thought he'd find those people dead, but somehow they got out of the doorway and were holding on to the outside. So in this picture, they haven't exited the raft yet, they're still trapped in there. But when he got to it, they were both out, thank God. And so he gets those 2, and he gets them up in the aircraft, and he's just beat, he's vomiting, Dan, and he's like thinking to himself, all that training, I did it, I got this 6 out of this raft. And then the pilot tells him, "Dan, we've got another life raft in the C-130, says there's 3 more people in it." And they go, "Do you think you can do it?" And you really got no option. He said, I'll try. And another picture was taken of the Bounty, and look how it's kind of risen out of the water. So as it was filling more, and maybe a wave nudged it, now the masts were out of the water a little later. It was almost like it was rising from the dead. It eventually sank later that afternoon.
I'm not sure you can see from your perspective, but the painting above it and the picture on the screen are eerily similar.
Sure is. I didn't notice that. You're right. Yeah, where the masts have been stripped. Yeah, especially similar to that black and white one I showed from the night vision goggles.
Right.
And a search goes on for Claudine and the captain all day, and later that afternoon, Claudine's body's found. They do CPR on her the whole way back, and she is expired. There's enough clues in the book that I think she got tangled in the rigging and was drowned when the ship originally went over. The captain, we don't know, because the body was never found. They searched and searched, and not a sign of the captain. And, as you're writing this book, it's a hard thing to do because the captain's not there to defend himself. And at the back of the book, I say, this man did an awful lot of good in his time, too, training young people and keeping these tall ships in operation. So it's not fair to just remember somebody by the one bad decision they made. He made a lot of good decisions prior to this. But Doug and I thought what happened was you grow overconfident, and when you don't have people really challenging you, and you're the expert way up here, and most of the others don't have nearly the experience, they don't challenge you as hard as they should. And so I think you grow overconfident and maybe even a little bit complacent. He'd been in hurricanes before. He even joked in a TV interview, we love hurricanes. We'd like to get in that southwest quadrant and ride that wind in the right direction. And these survivors, I have not talked to all of them. There could be one in this room for all I know. But I don't even know if they know how lucky they are, because everything had to go just right to extract all of them. Such as having the C-130 on scene just to get radio communications, rather than waiting for warning. Had that C-130 not been there, nobody would have known the bounty went over, and everything would have been different. These people would have been scattered all over the place. You can see his legs now they're filled with water. That was a big problem. But another lucky break was they put on the survival suits just minutes before the ship went over. If that didn't happen, forget it. So it's sad in some sense that this was an accident that didn't need to happen. But in another sense, it's really incredible what these young men and women of the Coast Guard do for total strangers who get themselves in trouble. They go out there and they put their lives on the line. I think it's a real tribute to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll be happy to take a couple of questions, and we will do the book signing in the back for Mother's Day and Father's Day. I'll let you decompress for your questions. I'll go back to what I said earlier, why I think they all said, yes, we're going to go with you, Captain. I think it's the way he presented it. He said to them, okay, you're free to leave. No hard feelings. We're leaving in 2 hours. He didn't give them time to say, go off alone and reflect, or call your parents, or look at the weather report. And when you're younger, as most of the crew was, and you've got this team, you don't want to let your team down. Because I would think, well, if I was there now, I would have been first to raise my hands and see in Florida. But if I was 22 years old, what would I have done? I probably would have stuck with my friends and not wanted to let them down. So I think there was some of that dynamic at play. Yes?
I'm curious what that Coast Guard helicopter was doing flying over the Rockies.
Oh, they were doing, they had done security for an event in conjunction with the Canadian government. So it was, because they do a lot more than search and rescue, they do a lot of drug interdiction, and they do some stuff we don't even know about, like they have snipers up in their Coast Guard helicopters, all sorts of stuff. Yep.
About 2 weeks ago, the Seaman Men's Club in Mashpee had an opportunity to go to the Coast Guard base. And at the end of the time that we were there, I think most people felt the technology, all the electronics they were showing us, all the way to go, was great. But the most important thing was the personnel.
Yeah.
We had 2 of the swimmers with us on this tour. And the character of these guys is really outstanding. I really appreciate what's going on when they're flying around up there, and you think they just go over and get a cup of coffee in Nantucket or something.
And you always think, maybe you're like me, you always think, oh, you know, they've been around a while, they're up near my age. These guys are young, and these girls are young, with such responsibility, and handle it so professionally. Like I had the radio transcripts of what they were saying during the bounty rescue, and they're professional as could be, even when things aren't going good. And I had to show you what's next. I told you I shifted focus a little bit from the rescue to Derek's gift, but here's a book coming out in 2 weeks. It's called The Cringe Chronicles, written with my daughter. Mortifying misadventures with my dad. She had to grow up with this eccentric father, being me, and she had this idea, I'm going to write about these crazy trips. And then I said, well, let me at the end put a dad's view, because my view is often different than yours of what happened. So it's kind of a dueling writers. She writes the bulk of the book and the chapters, but at the end, I get my say. I'm not as strange as she's making me out to be. So it was a fun project, and I think you need to intersperse these real serious things like the bounty with a fun project just to keep you even keeled. Because sometimes you're talking to people who are in tears with things like the bounty, and you need some fun. So I don't want to be known as the master of disaster. Although my daughter would say, yeah, you were a disaster with me growing up. One last question, yes?
Yeah, it sounds like the crew was a little naive too, in the sense that they were allowing him to make his presentation, to describe what he thought the voyage was going to be like, and never having been through something like that, the crew was not well informed.
It's true, not all of them knew the reports about the hurricane. And the way Adam explained it, Adam Prokan explained it to me, he said, I was kind of looking forward to this excitement. He said, we were like this football team that had been in training, and here's the big game. So again, it's some youth. Others were definitely more experienced, like John Spencer, he had his reservations. Claudine
But he still went.
But they still went, I know. Claudine had the reservations. Yes?
Just a brief one. They call it Superstorm Sandy, but obviously it was a hurricane. What was the category and what was the max sustained gusts that they were feeling?
The gusts out there were between 60 and 70 knot gusts that the air crews would tell me. And so you've had much higher gusts than that. I don't recall what the category was at that time. But again, it was the span of it, so the whole flight out was just getting beat up. And there was nowhere for the bounty to really run once they lost one of their engines. They're down to one engine. You can't use your sails. And just this final point, the seas did something I'd never heard of before. The rescue swimmers said they were coming from 3 different directions. They said, we've done rescues before, and they always come from one direction. He said, this time they were coming from 3 different directions, and with the Gulf Stream, it was carrying us right into the waves. So they said everything took longer than it should have, and that's why the first helicopter hit Bingo, and the second one had to come back before they could find Claudine, and so the third and fourth went back out. But I'll take more questions in the back, and thank you to the Historical Society for having me, and hope to be back soon. Thank you.